that you know that you have inside you, that you know that you feel for the people that are closest to you. That
Eddie Van Halen died with Valerie Bertinelli holding his hand, and she wasn't his wife when it happened. Their divorce had been finalized over a decade before that October morning in 2020, yet there she sat beside him in that hospital room, Wolfgang on the other side, ordering pizza and burritos because those were his favorite foods, because love sometimes expresses itself through the most ordinary gestures when everything else has fallen away. When Eddie took his final breath, they exchanged one last, "I love you," and when Valerie walked out of that building, she told people she felt like a widow, even though the marriage had ended 20 years prior. That single fact rewrites everything you assumed about their story. Most people carry the headline version. Rock legend Eddie Van Halen marries television sweetheart Valerie Bertinelli. Addiction destroys the marriage. Couple splits. Full stop. But the real account is stranger, more layered, and far more human than the tabloid version ever acknowledged. Valerie has spent recent years telling that story herself, in interviews, in her memoir, in raw Instagram posts written clearly at 2 in the morning when the feelings grew too large to contain. What she revealed is a portrait of a love that refused to follow any conventional script, a marriage that ended on paper but never quite closed emotionally, and a grief that arrived decades after it was supposed to. 1978. Valerie Bertinelli was 19 years old and one of the most recognizable faces on American television. Her role on One Day at a Time having made her exactly the kind of wholesome star that network executives built entire schedules around. Eddie Van Halen, meanwhile, had just detonated onto the rock scene with a debut album that made every guitarist alive reconsider their entire understanding of the instrument, tapping techniques that seemed physically impossible, a tone that sounded like electricity had developed emotions, and a stage presence that suggested he was having more fun than any human being had a right to. These two people existed in entirely separate worlds, and then backstage at a Van Halen concert in Shreveport, Louisiana, those worlds ran directly into each other. The attraction was instant, a relationship followed, and within 3 years they stood at an altar together. April 11, 1981, a private ceremony in California. Despite every reason it should have felt like a novelty arrangement, the people around them understood immediately that this was real. Eddie Van Halen, the man who could hold entire arenas in the palm of his hand, was genuinely and deeply in love with this woman, and Valerie loved him back with a fierceness that would still be visible nearly 4 decades later, sitting beside his hospital bed, refusing to leave him alone with his last hours. From the beginning, they tried to protect what they had. Despite being two of the most famous people in their respective industries, they kept the marriage as private as they could manage, refusing to perform it for cameras the way Hollywood expected. Then on March 16, 1991, Wolfgang William Van Halen arrived, and whatever they had constructed together became something more permanent. Wolfgang was, as Valerie would say years later, the best thing that ever happened to them, and he was also, though neither of them could have known it, the thread that would keep them woven into each other's lives long after everything else came apart. And things did come apart. Eddie's struggles with substance abuse had been present for years before they became impossible to work around, and the way addiction reshapes a person's personality in increments that their loved ones notice first accumulated into something the marriage couldn't absorb. Long separations from touring, the constant weight of fame, the relentless pressure on both sides, all of it built until it broke. Valerie has spoken about this with real candor, refusing the easier narrative that would let either of them off cleanly. She spoke about it the way people talk about genuinely complicated things, with honesty, with sadness, and with the recognition that love and damage can occupy the same person at the same time. By 2001, they had separated, and this is where it gets interesting because the separation itself was handled with a care that most couples in far simpler circumstances never manage. Rather than going to court and turning private pain into a public performance, they chose mediation, made decisions together about living arrangements, and ensured Wolfgang could move between them without disruption. Eddie personally checked that Valerie's new home sat close enough to remain convenient for their son, not because he was required to, but because he wanted to. The divorce filing came in December 2005, finalization in December 2007, marking the official end of a 26-year marriage. But Valerie has always been clear that the emotional reality was more complicated than any court document could capture, and that Eddie struggled for some time with the anger and grief the separation brought before finally getting it under control. Both of them moved on in the practical sense. Eddie married Janie Levi in 2009. Valerie married Tom Vitale in 2011, and that marriage also ran out of road eventually, with a divorce filing in November 2021. By then, Eddie was already gone. October 2020, 65 years old, and the illness that took him had started decades earlier. A tongue cancer diagnosis when Wolfgang was still a child, advancing through the years despite every effort until stage 4 lung cancer arrived in 2017 with a prognosis of only weeks to live. Treatments in Germany extended that by 3 years, years that Eddie and Wolfgang used to stay close, to plan a reunion tour that would never happen, to simply be father and son in whatever time remained. Valerie's account of those final days is one of the most quietly devastating things she has shared. She and Wolfgang kept vigil at the hospital, ordered pizza and burritos because maintaining some tiny piece of normalcy felt like the truest love available to them in that moment. And when the end came, she and Eddie said, "I love you" to each other. Not with the weight of regret, but with the plain truth of two people whose lives had been woven together long enough that the connection had become structural. "Grief doesn't follow a timeline," she said afterward, and she meant it. Walking out of that hospital feeling like a widow, not technically, not legally, but in every way that registered, she hadn't expected the depth of it, the way 20 years of separation turned out to be no insulation at all against that particular loss. Wolfgang carried his own version of this weight, and it started long before his father died. Joining Van Halen as bassist at just 15 years old placed him immediately in the most hostile version of public scrutiny, replacing Michael Anthony, a beloved figure, while critics questioned his qualifications loudly and without much charity. What those critics ignored was that Wolfgang hadn't joined for fame. He joined because his father's health was deteriorating and he wanted to be near him, and a 15-year-old who loves his father makes that trade without hesitation. The tension inside the band was real too. David Lee Roth declined to record a song Wolfgang had co-written, and the friction over his creative contributions never fully dissolved. Internet cruelty amplified everything, and Wolfgang has been honest about the toll it took, eventually making the decision to distance himself from online negativity as one of the most significant things he did for his own mental health. After Eddie's death, Wolfgang released Distance, a song written while his father was still alive and intended as a gift Eddie would receive in person. Instead, it became a memorial, built around home recordings of Eddie that gave the track an emotional depth almost too personal to sit with. Performing it still weighs on him, each time a reminder of the absence that now shapes a significant portion of his interior life. Sammy Hagar's connection to Eddie's memory took a different form entirely. About a year after Eddie's death, Hagar had a dream in which Eddie held a guitar and the two of them were simply enjoying each other's company, the way they had during the Van Halen years. Eddie began playing a riff. Hagar began to sing along, and when he snapped awake, he grabbed his phone and recorded every fragment he could hold on to. Those fragments sat with him for 2 years before he decided to finish the song, bringing in Joe Satriani, a scholar of Eddie's playing who had spent a year touring with Hagar performing Van Halen songs, along with Michael Anthony, drummer Kenny Aronoff, and eventually veteran Van Halen producers Ted Templeman and Don Landy. Near the song's conclusion sits a recording of a concert audience chanting Eddie's name, captured during the final show of the 1995 Balance Tour at the Neil S. Bladel Center in Honolulu, Hawaii, a moment Hagar hunted through countless recordings to find. The song is called Encore, Thank You, Good Night, and Hagar has stated without qualification that it began as a message from the afterlife. Valerie kept moving forward after all of it. Not moving on, she would correct that phrasing, because the two are not the same thing. After her divorce from Tom Vitale concluded, she stated she had no interest in dating again, wanting instead to focus on healing. Then, unexpectedly, she met Mike Goodenough, known online as the Horse Whisperer for his political commentary. Their connection began through Instagram, deepened through 2023, and by April 2024, Valerie confirmed the relationship publicly, describing it as unlike anything she had experienced before. The first time she had felt truly chosen and loved in a way that felt healthy and whole. By November 2024, it had ended, the breakup playing out with some public back and forth, Goodenough eventually clarifying on social media that he had been the one to end it. Valerie chose not to respond publicly, which is its own kind of answer. On her 65th birthday, the reflection she shared sounded genuinely hard-won. Gratitude for the difficult years as much as the good ones, a sense of finally seeing the end of a long tunnel. Her words, "I went through it all in the last handful of years, and I'm so grateful for the downs as much as I am for all of the ups. I am one lucky and grateful mother." Wolfgang marked the occasion with a childhood photo and a warm caption. The two of them still the most enduring relationship in either of their lives, the one that neither divorce nor death nor time has managed to loosen. What Valerie Bertinelli has given the world through all these interviews and unguarded public moments is not a cautionary tale and not a fairy tale. It is the account of two people who loved each other imperfectly and genuinely, who built a son together and raised him into someone real, who found their way back to a friendship that outlasted the marriage by decades, and who held each other's hands at the end because that is simply where they belonged. Some relationships change shape instead of ending. They become something language hasn't developed a precise word for, somewhere between love and shared history and the grief of losing someone who was once the entire center of your world. Eddie Van Halen surprised Valerie Bertinelli backstage in Shreveport in 1978, and then again in a hospital room in October 2020, and in all the quiet moments she doesn't speak about publicly, probably again and again in every year that came between.